Your father isn't dead. When a single dad janitor dares to interrupt the CEO's cold-hearted layoff speech with those shocking words, her entire world shatters, forcing her to face a hidden legacy that could save hundreds of families or destroy everything she's built. But will she have the courage to choose compassion before it's too late? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Charlotte Whitmore's corner office, casting long shadows across her mahogany desk. She stood before the full-length mirror, adjusting her perfectly pressed navy suit and pearl necklace. Everything had to be flawless today. The reflection showed exactly what she wanted others to see: power, control, and unwavering determination. The board's concerns about our quarterly projections cannot be ignored, she practiced, her voice crisp and authoritative. To maintain our market position, we must implement immediate cost-cutting measures. Charlotte's heels clicked against the polished marble floor as she paced, rehearsing the carefully crafted speech that would change hundreds of lives. The morning paper lay on her desk, its headlines screaming about market volatility. She'd already memorized every word of her presentation, but still she gripped the papers, scanning them one more time. The notification on her computer chimed, 15 minutes until the board meeting. Charlotte took a deep breath and walked to the window, looking down at the city sprawled 50 stories below. Tiny figures hurried along the sidewalks, unaware that their worlds were about to shift. "It's just business," she whispered to herself, the same words she'd repeated countless times throughout her career. Each time they felt a little more hollow, but she pushed that thought aside. Her office door opened, and her assistant Margaret stepped in. "Miss Whitmore, the board members are arriving early. They're gathering in the conference room now." "Thank you, Margaret." Charlotte gathered her materials, checking her reflection one final time. The woman staring back at her looked exactly like a CEO should: polished, professional, removed from emotional entanglements. As she strode down the hallway toward the conference room, employees quickly stepped aside, averting their eyes. They knew what was coming. Rumors had been circulating for weeks. Charlotte kept her gaze forward, her spine straight, ignoring the whispers that followed in her wake. The massive conference room doors loomed ahead. Through the glass walls, she could see the board members settling into their leather chairs, talking in hushed tones. A janitor worked quietly in the corner, his mop moving in steady strokes across the floor. She barely noticed him. Such workers were like furniture to her these days, part of the building's background. Charlotte paused outside the doors, taking one final steadying breath. The weight of what she was about to do pressed down on her shoulders, but she squared them against it. This was what leadership meant: making the hard choices, staying strong when others couldn't. For just a moment, an old memory flickered through her mind. Her father's weathered hands, dirty from factory work, as he counted out dollar bills at their kitchen table. "Every penny here," he'd said, "represents somebody's dinner, somebody's rent, somebody's medicine. Never forget that, Charlie." She pushed the memory away. That was a lifetime ago. Her father hadn't understood the realities of global business, the pressures of the market, the demands of shareholders. He'd been a simple man with simple values, values that had no place in today's corporate world. The conference room fell silent as she entered. 20 pairs of eyes followed her movement to the head of the table. The morning sun reflected off the polished surface, almost blindingly bright. Charlotte placed her papers precisely in front of her, adjusting them with steady hands. "Good morning," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. "I've called this emergency session to address the concerns raised in last week's shareholders' meeting." The board members leaned forward slightly, their expressions grave. They knew what was coming. They'd pushed for this, after all. Cost-cutting measures, streamlining operations, corporate. Speak for destroying lives. "Our market position requires immediate action," Charlotte continued, her practiced words flowing smoothly. "The proposed restructuring will involve significant workforce reductions across all lower-level positions." She could feel the tension in the room ratcheting higher with each word. The janitor's mop had stopped moving. In her peripheral vision, she saw him standing absolutely still, but she didn't turn to look. She never looked at the cleaning staff. The first phase of layoffs will begin immediately, affecting approximately 300 employees in maintenance, cafeteria services, and support staff positions. Her voice remained steady, professional, detached. This will be followed by a second phase, targeting mid-level positions in. Your father isn't dead. The words, spoken softly but with unmistakable clarity, cut through her speech like a knife. Charlotte's carefully constructed professional mask cracked for just a moment as she turned toward the voice. The janitor stood in the corner, his mop forgotten in his hands. His dark eyes met hers directly, something no employee at his level had dared to do in years. There was no challenge in his gaze, no anger, just a quiet certainty that made her blood run cold. The conference room fell into absolute silence. Board members shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, looking between Charlotte and the janitor with confused expressions. The papers in Charlotte's hands trembled slightly before she forced them still. Time seemed to freeze in that moment. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, but Charlotte felt suddenly cold. Her father had died 20 years ago. She'd buried him, mourned him, locked away the memories of his gentle wisdom, and replaced them with corporate strategies and profit margins. But something in the janitor's steady gaze, something in the quiet conviction of his voice, made her certainties waver. The carefully prepared speech in her hands suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The board members waited, watching their normally unshakable CEO stand frozen at the head of the table, staring at a janitor who had dared to speak out of turn. The moment stretched, taut as a wire about to snap, while Charlotte's world tilted on its axis. The boardroom fell into a deafening silence. Charlotte's manicured fingers gripped the podium, her knuckles turning white. 20 pairs of eyes darted between her and the janitor, who stood quietly in the corner, his mop forgotten in his weathered hands. Charlotte's voice faltered, something that hadn't happened in this room for over a decade. She cleared her throat, straightening her spine. We'll reconvene tomorrow morning. Meeting adjourned. Murmurs of confusion rippled through the room as board members gathered their papers and tablets. Charlotte didn't wait for their questions. She strode purposefully toward the door, her heels clicking against the polished floor. You, she said, pointing at Daniel without looking back. My office, now. In the hallway, Charlotte spun around so quickly that Daniel had to step back. Her carefully composed facade cracked, revealing something raw underneath. Anger, fear, or perhaps both. How dare you, she hissed, keeping her voice low despite the empty corridor. Who are you? What kind of sick joke is this? Daniel stood his ground, his work uniform a stark contrast to her designer suit. His eyes, warm and steady, met hers without flinching. No joke, Miss Whitmore. I worked with your father at the old factory on Mason Street, back when I was just starting out. Second shift maintenance crew. Charlotte's breath caught. The factory. She hadn't thought about that place in years. My father died 20 years ago. I was there. I planned the funeral. Yes, ma'am, you did. Daniel's voice remained gentle. But what I meant was, the father you knew isn't dead. The real Thomas Whitmore, the man I knew, lives on in his words, his actions, his legacy. And that man? He shook his head slowly. He wouldn't have wanted this. Charlotte crossed her arms, using anger to mask her unease. You don't know what my father would have wanted. You don't know anything about our family. I know he kept journals. Daniel's simple statement made Charlotte freeze. 3 notebooks, filled cover to cover with his thoughts, his hopes, especially about you. That's impossible, Charlotte whispered, but a memory stirred. Her father at the kitchen table late at night, writing in those worn, leather-bound notebooks. She'd forgotten about them, or maybe chosen to forget. Those were lost in the move after he died. No, ma'am. He gave them to me the week before he passed. Asked me to hold on to them. Daniel's eyes softened with compassion. Said someday his little girl might need reminding of who she really was, of what really mattered. Charlotte's perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the pallor that crept into her face. You're lying. Your father used to call you Charlie Bear, Daniel said quietly. Said you were fierce but gentle, just like the teddy bear you carried everywhere until you were 7. Charlotte staggered back slightly, bumping against the wall. Nobody knew that nickname. She'd buried it along with her father. The childhood memory hit her like a physical blow. Her father's deep laugh, his calloused hands lifting her high, his voice rough with love calling, "Come here, Charlie Bear." "He wrote about the night you broke your arm," Daniel continued, his voice still gentle. "You were 10. Instead of crying, you worried about missing your school presentation on helping endangered animals. He said that's when he knew you had a heart bigger than the whole world." Tears threatened to spill from Charlotte's eyes. She blinked them back furiously, her carefully constructed world tilting on its axis. "Stop!" But Daniel wasn't finished. "The last thing he wrote about was your graduation speech, about how proud he was that you talked about businesses having a responsibility to their communities, about how you promised to make the world better, not just richer." Charlotte's hand flew to her throat, clutching her pearl necklace like a lifeline. That speech, she'd almost forgotten. The passionate idealism of her younger self felt like a stranger now, yet Daniel's words brought it all rushing back. "The man I knew," Daniel said softly, "believed that profit without purpose was worthless. He taught me that true leadership means protecting those who depend on you, not sacrificing them for a better bottom line." Charlotte's legs felt weak. She leaned against the wall, no longer caring about maintaining her image. "The journals," she whispered. "You really have them?" "Yes, ma'am. Safe at home where they've been all these years. I've been waiting for the right moment." He gestured toward the boardroom. "When I heard about the layoffs, well, I figured maybe that moment had come." The layoff speech in her hand suddenly felt heavy, the pages burning against her skin. She looked down at the carefully crafted words about necessary restructuring and shareholder value. For the first time in years, she saw them through her father's eyes, through her own younger eyes, and felt shame wash over her. 250 people, Daniel said quietly. "That's how many families are on that list. I know because my daughter and I were one of them." Charlotte's head snapped up. "You're on the list?" "Night shift maintenance staff. First to go." He shrugged, but she saw the worry in his eyes. "My daughter Mia, she's hoping to start college next year. Been working extra shifts to help save up but without this job." He trailed off, leaving the implications hanging in the air. Charlotte looked back at the boardroom, then down at the speech in her trembling hands. 20 years of corporate climbing, of proving herself tougher and sharper than any man in that room, had led to this moment. She thought she was honoring her father's memory by becoming successful, but Daniel's words had cracked open something long buried. "The journals," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "I need to see them." "They're yours whenever you're ready," Daniel replied. He picked up his mop, preparing to return to work as if he hadn't just shaken her entire world. "Your father believed in you, Miss Whitmore. Not just in your success, but in your heart. Maybe it's time you remembered why." Charlotte watched him walk away, the layoff speech crumpled in her fist. For the first time in decades, she could hear her father's voice clearly in her mind, calling her Charlie Bear, reminding her of who she used to be, who she could be again. She looked down at the crumpled papers, seeing not just numbers and projections, but faces, families, dreams. 250 stories, including the quiet janitor who had somehow kept her father's words safe all these years. The speech that had seemed so certain that morning now felt impossible to give. The sun had long since set behind the city's glittering skyline when Charlotte finally made it back to her penthouse apartment. She didn't bother turning on the lights, letting the city's glow filter through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Her high heels clicked against the hardwood floors as she walked past her pristine kitchen, ignoring the expensive bottle of red wine that usually marked the end of her workday. Instead, she went straight to her home office. The room was immaculate, everything in its proper place, just the way she liked it. But tonight, her eyes fixed on the single frame that sat on her desk, gathering dust in the corner. She picked it up, her fingers trembling slightly as they traced the wooden edges. The photograph showed a younger version of herself, maybe 12 or 13, standing next to her father. He wore his factory uniform, his broad shoulders straight and proud despite the long hours of physical labor. Charlotte remembered how he always smelled of metal and honest sweat, how his calloused hands would awkwardly pat her shoulder instead of giving her the hug she secretly wanted. "What did he mean? You're not dead," she whispered to the photograph. Her father's eyes stared back at her, kind but distant, just as she remembered them. "We buried you. I was there." Charlotte sank into her leather chair, still holding the frame. The memory of that rainy afternoon at the cemetery rose unbidden in her mind. She had stood there, 17 and already too proud to cry, watching the coffin lower into the ground. Her mother had fallen apart in the months that followed, but Charlotte had thrown herself into her studies, determined to rise above their working-class roots. The frame felt heavy in her hands. When was the last time she'd really looked at this picture? Her father's face was clearer in this old photograph than in her memories. She noticed details she'd forgotten. The slight crinkle around his eyes, the way one corner of his mouth turned up more than the other when he smiled. "Compassion," she muttered, remembering Daniel's words. Your legacy was compassion? The idea seemed to mock everything she thought she knew about her father. He had been quiet, reserved, always working. Where was this compassionate man Daniel spoke of? Charlotte set the frame down and pulled out her phone, scrolling through her emails without really seeing them. The layoff announcement sat in her drafts folder, carefully worded by the PR team. Hundreds of families would be affected. Families like hers had been, after her father died, and the factory closed down. Her stomach growled, reminding her she hadn't eaten since morning, but food was the last thing on her mind. She got up and paced the length of her office, the city lights casting long shadows across the floor. The janitor, Daniel, had seemed so certain, so sincere, and those journals he mentioned, what secrets did those pages hold? What version of her father existed in those written words that she had never known? The questions tumbled through her mind, making rest impossible. Charlotte glanced at her watch. 11:40, 2 p.m. Too late to call, surely. But the thought of waiting until morning to know the truth seemed unbearable. She picked up her phone again, this time scrolling through the employee directory until she found Daniel Ruiz's number. Her finger hovered over the call button. This was inappropriate, unprofessional. CEOs didn't call janitors in the middle of the night. But then again, CEOs didn't usually have janitors dropping bombshells about their dead fathers in the middle of board meetings either. Charlotte took a deep breath and pressed call. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. She was about to hang up when a tired voice answered. "Hello? Mr. Ruiz? This is Charlotte Whitmore." There was a pause, then, "Miss Whitmore, I was wondering if you'd call. I need to see them," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. She softened her tone. "The journals. I need to see what my father wrote." "Of course," Daniel replied, and she could hear the understanding in his voice. "Would tomorrow work? I can bring them to your office." Charlotte looked at the photograph again, at her father's half-smile and distant eyes. "Yes," she said. "Tomorrow morning, first thing. And Mr. Ruiz?" "Yes. Thank you for telling me about my father. I know it couldn't have been easy. Your father was a good man, Miss Whitmore. He would be proud to see you leading his old company." Would he, though? Charlotte wondered as she ended the call. Would he be proud of the layoff she had planned? Of the cold corporate machine she'd built? She picked up the photograph one last time, studying her father's face as if it might hold the answers. But it remained as it always had, kind, distant, and full of secrets she was only now beginning to uncover. Charlotte's luxury car looked out of place on the narrow street, lined with weathered apartment buildings. She double-checked the address Daniel had texted her, frowning at the crumbling brick facade and rusty fire escape. This wasn't the kind of neighborhood she usually visited. The building's entrance had a broken intercom, so she had to call Daniel on her cell phone. His voice crackled through the speaker. "3rd floor, apartment 3B. The elevator's out of order again." She glanced down at her designer heels, then at the steep staircase. With a sigh, she began the climb, her hand barely touching the worn wooden railing. The stairwell smelled of cooking oil and cleaning products. When she reached the 3rd floor, slightly out of breath, Daniel was already waiting in his doorway. He had changed out of his janitor's uniform into worn jeans and a faded blue t-shirt. Miss Whitmore, he said with a small nod. Please come in. The apartment was tiny, but spotlessly clean. Crayon drawings decorated the walls, and a small table by the window held 3 mismatched chairs. A worn couch with carefully patched cushions faced a small TV, and the kitchen consisted of little more than a stove, a refrigerator, and a few cabinets. "Daddy, is she here?" A high-pitched voice called from another room. Before Daniel could answer, a small whirlwind in pink pajamas burst into the living room. Mia Ruiz skidded to a stop in front of Charlotte, her eyes wide with curiosity. "You're pretty," Mia declared, bouncing on her toes. "Do you want to see my stuffed animals? I have a whole collection, and—" "Mia," Daniel said gently, "remember what we talked about? Miss Whitmore is here for something important." Charlotte stood stiffly, unsure how to respond to such unfiltered enthusiasm. "Hello, Mia," she managed, her voice formal. But Mia wasn't deterred. She grabbed Charlotte's hand with sticky fingers, probably from breakfast, and tugged her toward the couch. "Sit here. It's the comfiest spot. That's where Daddy and I watch movies on Saturday nights." Charlotte perched carefully on the edge of the cushion, her designer's suit a stark contrast to the humble surroundings. She watched as Daniel disappeared into what must be a bedroom, returning with a cardboard box. "Mia, honey," he said, "why don't you go get dressed for school? Miss Martinez will be here soon to walk you." "But I want to stay," Mia protested. But one look from her father had her trudging back to her room, though not without a final bright smile at Charlotte. Daniel sat in the chair across from Charlotte, the box in his lap. "She's been excited since I told her you were coming," he explained. "She doesn't get many visitors besides her friends from school." Charlotte nodded stiffly, her eyes fixed on the box. "The journals?" Daniel's expression softened. "Yes, your father gave them to me about a month before he passed. Said I'd know when the time was right to share them." He pulled out a worn leather-bound notebook, its pages yellowed with age. "This is the earliest one I have, from when he first started at the factory." Charlotte's hands trembled slightly as she took the journal. The leather was soft from years of handling, and she could smell the faint mustiness of old paper. She opened it carefully, and her breath caught at the sight of her father's familiar handwriting. "May 15, 1985, she read aloud. "First day as floor supervisor. The men don't trust me yet. They think I'm just another suit looking down on them. But I remember what it was like on the line. A man's dignity isn't measured by his paycheck or his title. It's measured by how he treats others, especially when times are tough." She paused, her finger tracing the words. This didn't sound like the stern, distant man she remembered. Her father had always pushed her to reach higher, to focus on success and achievement. He'd never talked about dignity or compassion. "Keep reading," Daniel encouraged quietly. "Today, Joe Martinez's boy is sick, needs surgery. Joe tried to hide it, wanted to work overtime despite barely being able to stand. I sent him home, told him his shift was covered. The other men stepped up without being asked, splitting his hours between them. That's what real leadership looks like, not forcing people to choose between their families and their jobs." Charlotte's voice wavered. She remembered Joe Martinez. He'd come to their house once when she was young, bringing tamales his wife had made. But she'd never known about his son, or her father's intervention. "There's more," Daniel said. "He wrote almost every day, about the workers, their families, the small ways he tried to help while still running a tight ship. Your father understood that a company is more than just profit margins and quarterly reports. It's people, Miss Whitmore. Real people with real lives." Charlotte turned the page, finding more entries. Each one revealed a side of her father she'd never known. His quiet acts of kindness, his struggles to balance business needs with human compassion, his deep respect for the dignity of work. "I don't understand," she said finally, looking up at Daniel. "He never showed this side at home. It was always about excellence, about climbing higher, about not showing weakness." Daniel leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Maybe because he wanted to give you the tools to succeed, but trusted you'd find your own way to lead with heart. He was so proud of you, Miss Whitmore. But I think he worried that the corporate world would." A knock at the door interrupted him. "That's Miss Martinez," Daniel said, standing. "Time for Mia to go to school." Mia came racing out of her room, now dressed in a bright yellow dress and carrying a backpack covered in butterfly stickers. She threw her arms around Charlotte's waist before anyone could stop her. "Will you come visit again? Please?" Charlotte stared down at the small face turned up to hers, so full of innocent hope. For a moment, she saw herself at that age, before business suits and board meetings had become her whole world. Yes, perhaps I will." Daniel handed her the journal. "Take it home, read it properly. There's more where that came from when you're ready." Charlotte clutched the journal to her chest as she walked back down the stairs, her mind swimming with her father's words about dignity and sacrifice. She had thought she knew him, thought she was following his example, but now she wondered if she had ever really known him at all. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Whitmore Corp's executive floor, but there was no warmth in the conference room. 6 board members sat around the polished mahogany table, their faces as cold as the steel and glass building that housed them. Charlotte stood at the head of the table, her hands clasped behind her back. She wore her best Navy power suit, but somehow it felt like armor today. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the soft hum of the air conditioning. Miss Whitmore, Richard Bennett, the lead director, spoke first. His wire-rimmed glasses caught the light as he leaned forward. "Would you care to explain why you canceled yesterday's announcement without consulting the board?" Charlotte took a measured breath. "I needed time to review the impact of our decision. The human cost." "The human cost?" Margaret Chen, another board member, cut in sharply. "We discussed the human cost 3 months ago. We ran the numbers. We agreed this was necessary." "Things have changed," Charlotte said, keeping her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. "Nothing has changed," Richard countered, tapping his pen against a stack of financial reports. "Our profit margins are still dropping. Our shareholders are getting nervous. And now you've added uncertainty to the mix by postponing the announcement." The other board members nodded in agreement. Charlotte looked at each face around the table, people she'd worked with for years, people who'd always supported her tough decisions before. Now, they stared back at her with a mixture of confusion and disapproval. "I understand your concerns," Charlotte began, but Thomas Reynolds, the youngest board member, interrupted. "Do you?" His voice was sharp. "Because from where I sit, it looks like you're letting emotion cloud your judgment. This isn't like you, Charlotte. You've always understood that business is business." Charlotte felt her father's journal burning in her desk drawer just down the hall. The words she'd read last night echoed in her mind. A company isn't just numbers on a page. It's people, their hopes, their families, their dignity. "I'm not being emotional," she said firmly. "I'm being thorough. Laying off 300 employees isn't just a line item. We need to explore other options." Richard exchanged glances with Margaret before speaking again. "Charlotte, let me be clear. The board has supported you because you've always made smart, practical decisions. But if you're changing course now..." He left the threat hanging in the air. "Are you suggesting I'm unfit to lead this company?" Charlotte's voice was quiet but sharp. "We're suggesting," Margaret said, her tone carefully diplomatic, "that if you can't follow through with necessary business decisions, we'll need to find someone who can." The words hit Charlotte like a physical blow. She'd spent 20 years climbing to this position, sacrificing everything, relationships, family, personal time, to prove she was tough enough, smart enough, worthy enough. "You have until the end of the week," Richard announced, closing his portfolio with a decisive snap. "Either we move forward with the original plan, or we'll be forced to call a special vote of the board." One by one, the board members gathered their things and filed out. Only Thomas lingered, pausing at the door. "For what it's worth, Charlotte, I've always admired your decisiveness. Don't lose that now." When she was finally alone, Charlotte walked slowly back to her office. Her heels clicked against the marble floors, each step echoing in the empty hallway. Her assistant tried to hand her a stack of messages, but she waved them away. Inside her office, she closed the door and leaned against it, letting out a long breath. The view from her window showed the city sprawling below, a city where 300 of her employees lived, worked, raised their families. Somewhere down there, Daniel was probably mopping floors, working to support his daughter. She crossed to her desk and pulled out her father's journal. The leather was worn soft with age, the pages yellow and dog-eared. She opened it randomly, her fingers trembling slightly. "Leadership isn't about being the toughest or the coldest," she read. "It's about having the courage to do what's right, even when it costs you something." Charlotte sank into her chair, holding the journal close to her chest. The morning sun warmed her face, but she felt cold inside. The weight of 300 jobs pressed down on her shoulders, along with 20 years of corporate success that could vanish by the end of the week. "I hear you, Dad," she whispered, running her fingers over the journal's worn cover. "I'm trying to understand what you were trying to teach me." She glanced at the family photo on her desk, the only personal item in her Stark office. It showed her father in his work clothes, smiling proudly at his daughter's college graduation. She'd been so young then, so sure she knew everything about success and leadership. Charlotte sat up straighter in her chair, still clutching the journal. "I won't let them down," she said quietly, though she wasn't sure if she meant the employees, her father, or herself. "There has to be another way." The intercom buzzed, her assistant's voice breaking the silence. "Miss Whitmore? The press is calling about rumors of the layoffs. And the shareholders' report needs your signature." Reality crashed back in. Charlotte looked at the journal in her hands, then at the stack of financial reports waiting on her desk. The board's deadline loomed over her like a shadow, but her father's words burned brighter. Charlotte's Mercedes felt out of place in the modest neighborhood where Daniel lived. The evening sky had turned a soft purple, and yellow lights glowed warmly from the windows of the small apartment buildings. She double-checked the address on her phone, though she already knew it by heart from her visit that morning. Her hand hesitated over the steering wheel. The weight of the day's confrontation with the board still pressed heavily on her shoulders. But something pulled her forward. Perhaps the memory of those journal entries, or maybe just the need to escape the suffocating pressure of her corporate world for a few hours. The steps to Daniel's second-floor apartment creaked under her heels. Before she could knock, the door flew open, and Mia's beaming face greeted her. "Miss Charlotte, you came!" Mia grabbed her hand without hesitation, tugging her inside. "Daddy's making his special enchiladas." The small apartment smelled of spices and warmth. Daniel appeared in the kitchen doorway, wearing a plain white t-shirt and jeans, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "Charlotte, welcome. Hope you like Mexican food." "I can't remember the last time I had a home-cooked meal," Charlotte admitted, allowing Mia to lead her to their small dining table. The furniture was worn but clean, and colorful drawings decorated the walls, clearly Mia's artwork. "Daddy makes the best food," Mia declared, climbing onto her chair. "Even better than the cafeteria at school." Daniel laughed, a sound that filled the small space with genuine joy. "That's not saying much, Mija." He set down a steaming plate in front of Charlotte. "It's not fancy, but it's my mother's recipe." Charlotte looked down at the carefully prepared meal, so different from her usual catered business dinners or lonely takeout in her penthouse. "It looks wonderful," she said softly. As they ate, Mia's curiosity bubbled over. "Miss Charlotte, did your daddy cook for you too?" The question caught Charlotte off guard. She set down her fork, memories flooding back. "Sometimes he wasn't very good at it, but every Sunday he would try to make pancakes." "Were they yummy?" Mia's eyes widened with interest. A smile tugged at Charlotte's lips. They were usually burned on one side and raw on the other. But he never gave up trying. "Just like when I try to make toast," Mia giggled. "Daddy has to help me not burn it." Daniel watched the exchange quietly, a gentle understanding in his eyes. "Your father seemed like a patient man, from what I remember." Charlotte nodded, surprised by how easily the memories came now. "He was, even when I was difficult, and I often was. He never lost his temper. He would just—" She paused, reaching for words she hadn't thought about in years. "He would just sit with me until I was ready to talk." "Did you have a favorite game to play with him?" Mia asked, scooping up another bite of rice. Charlotte's guard lowered further as she remembered. "We had this old checkers set. The pieces were all scratched up, and one was missing. We had to use a bottle cap instead, but we played almost every evening after dinner." "Can you teach me checkers?" Mia's question was eager, hopeful. "Mia," Daniel started, but Charlotte interrupted gently. "I'd like that, actually." The words surprised her as much as they seemed to surprise Daniel. After dinner, while Daniel cleaned up, Mia showed Charlotte her homework, a simple math worksheet with cartoon animals. Charlotte found herself sitting cross-legged on the floor, helping Mia count apples and oranges, her usual corporate poise forgotten. "Miss Charlotte?" Mia asked as they finished the last problem. "What did your daddy do when you got sad?" The question pierced straight through Charlotte's carefully maintained walls. She glanced at Daniel, who had paused in his dishwashing, then back at Mia's innocent face. Charlotte's voice softened. "He used to sing this silly song about a purple elephant. It was terrible. He couldn't carry a tune to save his life. But it always made me laugh." "Can you sing it?" Mia's eyes sparkled with hope. "Oh, I don't," Charlotte began, but Mia's expectant face melted her resistance. Quietly, barely above a whisper, she sang the first few lines of the nonsense song she hadn't thought about in decades. Mia clapped in delight, and even Daniel smiled warmly from the kitchen. For a moment, Charlotte felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the simple joy of being herself, without titles or expectations. The evening passed too quickly. Before Charlotte knew it, the clock showed 9:30 p.m., well past Mia's bedtime. "Will you tell me more stories next time?" Mia asked sleepily, as Daniel carried her to bed. Charlotte stood in the doorway, her designer suit now slightly wrinkled from sitting on the floor. "Yes," she found herself promising. "Next time." As she gathered her things to leave, Daniel walked her to the door. "Thank you for joining us," he said simply. "Thank you for having me," Charlotte replied, suddenly aware of how different this evening had been from her normal routine of late meetings and business calls. Standing in the hallway outside their apartment, Charlotte felt the weight of two worlds pulling at her. Behind her was the warmth of Daniel's home, with its crayon drawings and simple truths. Ahead lay her penthouse, her corporate responsibilities, and the board's threats. For the first time in years, she wasn't sure which way to turn. Morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the conference room, casting long shadows across the polished table. Charlotte stood at the head of the room, her usual crisp blazer traded for a softer navy cardigan. The change wasn't lost on her employees, who exchanged curious glances. "As of today," Charlotte began, her voice steady but gentler than usual, "we're implementing several new company-wide initiatives." She clicked to the first slide of her presentation, revealing a list of employee benefits. "First, we're raising the minimum wage for all workers to ensure everyone can support their families with dignity." A murmur rippled through the room. Janet from accounting dropped her pen. Tom from HR sat up straighter, his eyes widening. "Additionally," Charlotte continued, "we're launching a scholarship program for employees' children." She thought of Mia's bright smile and Daniel's tired eyes. Education shouldn't be a luxury. The middle managers shifted in their seats. Some looked excited, others skeptical. Mark Stevens, a longtime department head, raised his hand. "Miss Whitmore, while these sound admirable, what about the shareholders?" Charlotte had expected this question. She clicked to the next slide, displaying a graph. Studies show that companies with strong worker support programs actually see increased productivity and lower turnover. "Yes, there's an initial investment, but the long-term benefits—" "This is unprecedented," interrupted Barbara from finance, but her tone held more wonder than criticism. "In all my 15 years here—" "Exactly," Charlotte said, allowing a small smile. "It's time for unprecedented change." She moved through more slides, outlining flexible work hours, improved healthcare coverage, and professional development programs. The board members sat stone-faced at the back of the room. Richard Thompson, the most vocal opponent of her recent decisions, typed furiously on his phone. Charlotte knew he was probably messaging other board members, plotting their next move against her. But something had changed within her. The fear that usually gripped her when facing opposition felt distant now. She thought of her father's words in his journal. "True leadership isn't about being the biggest or richest. It's about lifting others up." After the presentation, people lingered, talking in excited clusters. Young Sarah from reception approached Charlotte with tears in her eyes. My daughter. With the scholarship program, she could actually go to college. I never thought. Charlotte squeezed the young woman's shoulder, remembering how her own father had worked extra shifts to put her through business school. That's exactly why we're doing this. Later that afternoon, she found Daniel cleaning the windows in her office. He worked methodically, but she noticed he was humming softly, something she'd never heard him do before. I heard about the meeting, he said, not turning around. Word travels fast, even to us janitors. Charlotte sank into her chair, suddenly exhausted but oddly peaceful. The board thinks I've lost my mind. Thompson actually used the word mutiny in his email. Daniel set down his cleaning cloth and faced her. You know what I think? His eyes were kind, but serious. I think your father would be proud, not just of what you're doing, but why you're doing it. Something warm bloomed in Charlotte's chest, a feeling so foreign she almost didn't recognize it. Joy. Real, simple joy. Like when she was a little girl, and her father would lift her onto his shoulders to watch parades. I found another entry in his journal last night, she said softly. He wrote about how he wanted me to remember that success isn't measured in dollars, but in the lives we touch. She smiled, and for once, didn't try to hide the emotion in her voice. I wish I'd understood that sooner. You understand it now, Daniel replied. That's what matters. Looking out over the city through her spotless windows, Charlotte felt that unfamiliar joy settle deeper into her heart. For the first time in years, she knew with absolute certainty that she was doing the right thing not because it was profitable or prestigious, but because it was right. The afternoon sun painted the office in warm gold, and Charlotte allowed herself to simply sit in that moment, holding on to the joy that had eluded her for so long. She looked at Daniel, who had returned to his work, still humming quietly, and felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the strange way her father's memory had found its way back to her through this humble janitor. The industrial elevator groaned as it descended to the factory floor. Charlotte smoothed her cardigan, feeling strangely nervous. It had been 20 years since she'd last visited this part of the building. Back then, she'd been a young executive eager to prove herself. Now, she stood in the same elevator with different eyes. The doors opened with a metallic ding. The familiar scent of machine oil and warm plastic filled her nose. The factory floor stretched before her, a maze of conveyor belts and assembly stations humming with activity. Workers in Navy uniforms moved with practiced efficiency, their faces focused on their tasks. Daniel stood beside her, clipboard in hand. "These are the people you saved," he said quietly. "Would you like to meet them?" Charlotte nodded, her throat tight. As they walked down the main aisle, the workers glanced up. Some quickly looked away, while others stared openly at their CEO. Charlotte forced herself to make eye contact, to smile. She stopped at the first station, where a middle-aged woman was inspecting circuit boards. "Hello," Charlotte said, extending her hand. "I'm Charlotte Whitmore." The woman wiped her hands on her uniform, before shaking Charlotte's. "Maria Rodriguez, Quality Control. Been here 15 years. Tell me about your work, Maria." As Maria explained her role, Charlotte noticed the woman's hands, careful, precise, marked with small scars from years of detailed work. She saw the pride in Maria's eyes when she demonstrated how she caught defects that automated systems missed. "How are you doing?" Charlotte asked. "Really doing?" Maria hesitated, then seemed to gather her courage. It's not easy, Miss Whitmore. My son's in college now, first in our family." "The tuition." She shook her head. "But this job, it's helping us make it happen. When we heard about the layoffs." Her voice cracked slightly. Charlotte touched her arm. "Tell me more about your son." They spent the next hour moving through the factory floor. Each worker had a story. Tom Jenkins had worked there for 30 years and needed surgery he couldn't afford. Sarah Chen was a single mother juggling night shifts with childcare. James Wilson was supporting both his children and his elderly parents. At each station, Charlotte listened. She shook hands. She learned names. The factory floor began to transform from a line item in budget reports to a living, breathing community. These weren't numbers on a spreadsheet. They were families, dreams, struggles, and hopes. Near the end of the tour, they reached a station where an older man was carefully assembling electronic components. His nameplate read, Frank Miller. His hands trembled slightly as he worked, but his movements were precise. "Miss Whitmore," he said, looking up. His eyes were red, rimmed. I need to thank you." Charlotte noticed a photo taped to his workstation. A young woman in a graduation cap and gown. "Your daughter?" she asked. Frank nodded. "Emily. She's starting medical school next year." He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "When we heard about the layoffs, I thought it was over. Everything we'd worked for. I'm 63. Who would hire me at my age? But you." His voice broke. "You stopped it, just like your father would have done." Charlotte's heart stumbled. "You knew my father?" Everyone knew Robert Whitmore. He'd walk these floors every week. Knew everyone's names, their kids' names. When my wife was sick, he made sure we had the best health care coverage. Frank's voice grew stronger. "He always said a company was only as strong as its people. That profit without purpose was meaningless." Charlotte felt tears pressing behind her eyes. She thought of the cold boardroom upstairs, of spreadsheets and profit margins. How far she'd strayed from her father's path. "Thank you, Frank," she managed to say. "For remembering him. For reminding me." As they finished the tour, more workers approached. Some just wanted to shake her hand. Others shared their stories, of medical bills paid, of children educated, of homes kept. Each story was a thread connecting her to her father's legacy, to the real impact of the decision she'd made. The setting sun painted the factory windows orange as Charlotte walked back to her car. Her designer heels clicked against the concrete, but she barely noticed the sound. Her mind was full of faces, names, stories. The weight of responsibility felt different now, not a burden of profit margins and shareholder value, but a privilege of guardianship over these lives and dreams. In her car, she sat for a moment, hands on the steering wheel. The parking lot was emptying as the day shift ended. Workers streamed out, heading to their cars or the bus stop. Parents rushing home to children. Students hurrying to night classes. Lives intertwined with the company her father had helped build. A knock on her window startled her. It was Maria from Quality Control, holding something in her hands. Charlotte lowered the window. "Miss Whitmore," Maria said, her voice thick with emotion. I wanted to give you this." She handed Charlotte a small photo frame. Inside was a picture of the factory workers, taken at last year's company picnic. Hundreds of smiling faces looked back at her. "We're not just employees," Maria said, tears in her eyes. "We're a family. Your father understood that. And now you do too. Thank you for saving our jobs. Thank you for giving us hope." Charlotte clutched the frame to her chest, unable to speak. Maria squeezed her hand once and walked away, leaving Charlotte alone with her thoughts and the weight of her father's legacy. As she drove home through the darkening city, Charlotte's heart felt both heavy and curiously light. The faces from the factory floor stayed with her. Their stories, their struggles, their gratitude. For the first time in years, she felt truly connected to something larger than quarterly reports and stock prices. She felt connected to her father's vision of what a company could be, not just a profit machine, but a community, a family, a force for good. The city lights blurred slightly through her tears, but her path forward had never been clearer. The evening sun cast long shadows through Daniel's small apartment windows as Charlotte sat on the worn but comfortable couch, her father's leather-bound journal open in her lap. Mia nestled close to her side, eyes wide with curiosity, while Daniel worked quietly in the kitchen, preparing a simple dinner of spaghetti and meatballs. "Can you read another story, Auntie Charlotte?" Mia asked, the nickname making Charlotte's heart skip a beat. She still wasn't used to such affection. Charlotte smoothed the weathered page with trembling fingers. "Of course, sweetheart." The paper felt delicate beneath her touch, and her father's familiar handwriting brought a lump to her throat. She cleared it quickly and began to read. "December 15th, 1985, she started. "Today at the factory, I met a young man whose car broke down in the parking lot. He couldn't afford repairs, and without transportation, he would lose his job. I remembered when I was young and struggling, how one act of kindness changed everything for me, so I helped him get it fixed." Mia snuggled closer. Your daddy was so nice." The simple truth in the child's words made Charlotte pause. She turned the page, the scent of old paper, mixing with the warm aroma of tomato sauce wafting from the kitchen. "Here's another one," Charlotte continued. "March 3rd, 1986. Jimmy's daughter needed medicine, but his insurance hadn't kicked in yet. Couldn't let a child suffer. Gave him the money as a bonus so his pride wouldn't be hurt. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is their dignity." Daniel's movements in the kitchen slowed, and Charlotte noticed him listening more intently. She read entry after entry, each one revealing a father she barely knew, a man who secretly paid for Christmas presents for employees' children, who arranged carpools for workers without cars, who fought against wage cuts, even when it meant risking his own position. "Your father sounds like a superhero," Mia declared, playing with the charm bracelet on Charlotte's wrist. Charlotte smiled softly. "I'm starting to think he might have been." She glanced at Daniel, who had stopped cooking entirely and was leaning against the kitchen counter, a distant look in his eyes. "There's one more entry I'd like to read," Charlotte said, turning to a page marked with a faded blue ribbon. "July 12th, 1987. Today, one of our youngest workers came to me in tears. His wife just had their first baby, but they were 3 months behind on rent. The landlord was threatening eviction. Couldn't let a family with a newborn end up on the street. Paid their back rent myself and arranged a small raise to help them stay afloat. Some might call it crossing a line, but there are times when doing the right thing matters more than following rules." The sound of a pot lid clattering made Charlotte look up. Daniel stood frozen, his face pale with emotion. "Daniel?" Charlotte asked, concerned. "Are you all right?" He walked slowly to the living room, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "That young worker," he said softly, his voice thick. "That was me." Charlotte stared at him, the journal nearly slipping from her hands. "What?" "Maria had just given birth to Mia," Daniel continued, sitting heavily in the armchair across from them. "We were so young, barely making ends meet. I was too proud to ask for help, but your father." He paused, emotion making his voice rough. "He called me into his office that day. Said he'd heard about our situation. I tried to refuse his help, but he wouldn't take no for an answer." Mia looked between them with wide eyes. "Is that true, Daddy?" Daniel nodded, reaching out to squeeze his daughter's hand. "If it wasn't for Charlotte's father, we would have lost everything. That's why." He met Charlotte's stunned gaze. "That's why I had to speak up in that boardroom. I owed him that much. When I heard about the layoffs, I knew I had to remind you of who he really was." Charlotte's hands trembled as she touched the worn pages of the journal. All these weeks of reading her father's words, of discovering his secret acts of kindness, and now this revelation, that the very man who had helped her rediscover her father's legacy was himself living proof of that legacy. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she whispered. Daniel shook his head. "You needed to find your way back to his memory on your own. If I had told you right away, it might have felt like manipulation. But now," he gestured to the journal, "now you know who he really was. Not just through my story, but through all of these stories." Mia climbed into her father's lap, and they sat in silence for a moment, the weight of this revelation filling the small apartment. The evening light had faded to a deep purple, and the kitchen timer beeped softly, reminding them of the waiting dinner. "Your father saved us," Daniel said quietly. "And he never asked for anything in return, never made me feel less than. He just helped, because it was the right thing to do." Charlotte looked down at the journal, her vision blurring with tears. Her father's words took on new meaning now, knowing that Daniel, this kind, honest man who had dared to speak truth to power, was living proof of her father's compassion. The connection between them wasn't just about shared memories or lost journals. It was about a debt of gratitude, a promise kept, and a legacy of kindness that had come full circle. Charlotte stood at the podium in the company's main conference hall, her heart beating steadily as she faced hundreds of employees. The room buzzed with anticipation. Bright camera flashes popped from the press section, but for once, she didn't mind the attention. "My father," she began, her voice clear and strong, "worked in factories his whole life. He taught me that true success isn't measured by stock prices or quarterly reports. It's measured by the lives we touch. She paused, looking at Daniel, who stood near the back of the room, giving her an encouraging nod. The large screen behind her lit up with the company's new logo, Whitmore Legacy Initiative, written in warm, welcoming colors. Today, we're not just announcing a program, we're reclaiming our company's soul. She clicked to the first slide, showing smiling children in graduation caps. First, the Whitmore Scholarship Fund. Every employee's child will have access to college funding. Gasps and murmurs filled the room. No more choosing between rent and education. No more delayed dreams. In the audience, a mother wiped tears from her eyes while hugging her teenage daughter. Charlotte felt her own eyes growing moist, but continued with renewed determination. Second, our fair wage promise. The next slide appeared. Starting next month, every employee's salary will be reviewed and adjusted to exceed living wage standards by at least 20%. The room erupted in applause, but Charlotte raised her hand gently. Wait, there's more. She clicked to the next slide. The wellness program includes full health coverage, mental health support, and on-site childcare facilities. More applause, louder this time, because no parent should have to choose between work and their child's well-being. From his spot near the wall, Daniel beamed with pride. Little Mia, standing next to him in her best dress, bounced excitedly. This initiative, Charlotte continued, her voice softening with emotion, is dedicated to James Whitmore, my father. A man who understood that business isn't just about profits, it's about people. The presentation concluded with thunderous applause. Reporters rushed forward, cameras flashing, questions flying. But Charlotte's attention was drawn to the employees, the real people whose lives would change. Some were crying, others hugging their colleagues. A maintenance worker removed his cap in respect, nodding at her with glistening eyes. After the formal proceedings, Charlotte found herself in a quiet corner of the building's garden with Daniel and Mia. The late afternoon sun painted everything in warm golden light. Mia was spinning in circles, making her dress twirl. "Did you see how happy everyone was, Miss Charlotte?" Mia asked, dizzy but grinning. "You made them all smile." "I saw something else, too," Daniel added softly. "I saw your father in you today. The way you spoke about dignity and family, that was pure James Whitmore." Charlotte felt something warm bubble up inside her chest. It started as a small chuckle, then grew into genuine laughter, free and unrestrained. She couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed like this. Mia joined in, her giggles infectious, and soon Daniel was laughing too. They sat on a wooden bench, surrounded by blooming flowers and the sound of their shared joy. Charlotte realized with startling clarity that this simple moment of happiness felt more like success than any business deal she'd ever closed. "You know what?" Mia said, climbing onto the bench between them. "We should have ice cream to celebrate." "Ice cream?" Charlotte pretended to consider it seriously. "Well, I suppose that's what families do after big presentations, right?" The word family slipped out naturally, and for once, Charlotte didn't feel the need to take it back or qualify it. She looked at Daniel's gentle smile and Mia's excited face and felt something she'd been missing for decades: belonging. Their laughter echoed through the garden again, mixing with the soft rustle of leaves and the distant sounds of the city. In that moment, Charlotte understood that her father's legacy wasn't just about business principles or charitable programs. It was about creating these precious moments of connection, of genuine human warmth. She watched as Mia picked a dandelion and blew its seeds into the air, making a wish. Daniel's eyes crinkled with affection as he watched his daughter. The late afternoon sun warmed their faces, and Charlotte felt lighter than she had in years. The weight of corporate expectations and shareholder demands seemed to melt away in the presence of this simple, pure joy. "So," Daniel said, eyes twinkling, "about that ice cream." Charlotte stood up, smoothing her skirt but keeping her smile. "Lead the way. I know a great place around the corner." As they walked together, Mia skipping between them and chattering about her favorite flavors, Charlotte felt a deep sense of rightness settle over her. This was what her father had tried to teach her all along, that true leadership wasn't about standing alone at the top, but about bringing people together, creating joy, and sharing it freely. The warmth of the moment wrapped around them like a comfortable blanket, and Charlotte couldn't help but laugh again at one of Mia's silly jokes. The sound of their shared happiness filled the air, a testament to the unexpected family she had found in the most unlikely of places. The morning sun painted golden streaks across the city park as Charlotte held 2 rainbow-colored kites in her hands. She felt oddly nervous, like a student before an important test. Spending time with children had never been her forte. Board meetings and corporate negotiations were more her comfort zone. "Can I pick which one I want?" Mia bounced on her toes beside her, her dark curls dancing in the spring breeze. Charlotte smiled, holding out both kites. "Of course you can. I want the purple one." Mia grabbed it eagerly, then looked up at Charlotte with bright eyes. "Have you ever flown a kite before?" "Not since I was about your age," Charlotte admitted, memories of her father teaching her flickering through her mind. How long ago had that been? 30, maybe 40 years? Mia's face lit up. "I'll teach you. Daddy showed me how last summer." She grabbed Charlotte's hand without hesitation, pulling her toward an open stretch of grass. The simple touch of the little girl's warm fingers wrapped around hers made Charlotte's throat tight with unexpected emotion. They spent the next hour running across the park, their kites dancing in the wind. Mia's delighted squeals echoed across the grass every time her purple kite swooped and soared. Charlotte found herself laughing too, really laughing, as she chased her own blue kite through the sky. "You're doing it," Mia cheered, when Charlotte's kite caught an updraft and climbed higher. "See, it's easy when you just let go a little." "Let go a little." Charlotte's smile softened as she watched her kite float peacefully above. When was the last time she had just let go, released her iron grip on control, and allowed herself to play? After their arms grew tired from holding the kite strings, they collapsed onto a park bench. Charlotte pulled 2 bottles of water from her bag, handing one to Mia. "Can we get ice cream?" Mia asked, pointing to a cheerful cart nearby with a striped umbrella. "Please? Daddy always lets me get 2 scoops on special days." "Is today a special day?" Charlotte asked, already reaching for her purse. "Every day we spend with you is special," Mia said matter-of-factly, as only children can. The simple honesty of her words made Charlotte's chest ache. At the ice cream cart, Mia ordered chocolate and strawberry, while Charlotte chose vanilla. They sat on a bench watching dogs chase frisbees and families spread picnic blankets on the grass. Charlotte's vanilla ice cream dripped onto her designer pants, but for once she didn't care about the stain. "My daddy says you work too hard," Mia said between licks of her ice cream. "He says you forget to have fun sometimes." Charlotte paused, her ice cream forgotten. "Your daddy is very wise. Why do you forget? Is it because you're sad?" The question hit Charlotte like a physical blow. Out of the mouths of babes, indeed. She looked down at her melting ice cream, considering how to answer. "Sometimes," she said carefully, "grown-ups get so busy trying to be successful that they forget what's really important." "Like flying kites?" Mia asked. "Like flying kites," Charlotte agreed. "And spending time with people who care about you." Mia nodded sagely, chocolate ice cream smeared around her mouth. "Well, you don't have to be sad anymore. You have me and Daddy now." Charlotte blinked back sudden tears. All those years climbing the corporate ladder, accumulating wealth and power, and here was this child offering the very thing she'd been missing. Simple, unconditional love. They spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the park. Mia showed Charlotte her favorite climbing tree, though Charlotte declined to attempt it herself. They fed ducks at the pond, counted clouds that looked like animals, and collected pretty leaves that had fallen early. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the grass, Charlotte drove them back to Daniel's apartment. Mia chatted the whole way, telling stories about school and her friends, while Charlotte listened with genuine interest to every word. Daniel was waiting at the door when they arrived, smiling at his daughter's excited recounting of their day. "Sounds like you two had quite an adventure," he said, his eyes meeting Charlotte's with warm understanding. "Can Charlotte tuck me in?" Mia asked as she changed into her pajamas. "Please, Daddy." Daniel nodded, and Charlotte followed Mia into her small bedroom. The walls were covered with crayon drawings and photos of Mia with her father. A worn teddy bear sat proudly on the pillow. Charlotte helped Mia climb under her butterfly pattern covers, then sat on the edge of the bed. "Thank you for teaching me how to fly a kite today," she said softly. Mia reached out and took Charlotte's hand, her small fingers tracing the lines on her palm. "Thank you for being my friend," she whispered. Then, so quietly, Charlotte almost missed it. "You're like the mommy I don't remember." Charlotte's breath caught in her throat. She squeezed Mia's hand gently, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. The little girl's eyes were already closing, tired from their day of adventure. For a long moment, Charlotte sat there, watching Mia drift off to sleep, her heart full of emotions she couldn't quite name. Here, in this modest apartment, with a child who saw past all her corporate armor straight to her heart, Charlotte finally understood what her father had been trying to teach her all along. Success wasn't measured in stock prices or corner offices. It was measured in moments like these, in kite strings and ice cream cones, in trust freely given, and love unconditionally offered. Charlotte's heels clicked against the marble floor of the corporate headquarters lobby, her steps confident as always, but something felt different this morning. The security guard who usually greeted her with a warm, "Good morning, Miss Whitmore," kept his eyes down. At the elevator, a group of junior executives stopped whispering the moment she approached. Her executive assistant, Janet, wasn't at her desk. Instead, a stack of newspapers lay there, their headlines screaming in bold black letters. Charlotte's stomach clenched as she read them. Whitmore Industries CEO shows signs of instability. Reckless spending threatens company's future. Shareholders question CEO's mental state. Her hands trembled as she gathered the papers and pushed open her office door. Inside, Janet stood by the window, phone pressed to her ear. She turned, face pale. "I'll call you back," Janet said into the phone, then faced Charlotte. "Miss Whitmore, I've been trying to reach you. The board called an emergency meeting for 9 o'clock. Charlotte glanced at her watch. 20 minutes. She dropped the newspapers on her desk and sank into her chair. "What happened, Janet?" "Someone leaked information to the press last night. About the Legacy Initiative. They're saying it's reckless spending of company resources." Janet hesitated. "There are also rumors about your emotional state, suggesting that personal issues are affecting your judgment." Charlotte's throat tightened. She'd expected resistance to her changes, but this was character assassination. Her phone buzzed. Text messages flooded in from board members, major shareholders, and business reporters. The company's stock had dropped 12% in pre-market trading. "Get me Richard from PR," Charlotte ordered, her voice steady despite the chaos churning inside her. "And call legal. I want them in my office before." The door burst open. Marcus Sterling, head of the board, strode in without knocking. 2 other board members followed close behind. "The meeting's been moved up," Marcus announced, his gray suit as crisp as his tone. "We're doing this now." Charlotte stood, drawing herself to her full height. "This is highly irregular, Marcus. I haven't had time to—" "What's irregular is watching 30 years of careful business building get destroyed in a matter of weeks." Marcus slapped a folder on her desk. "Your pet project is hemorrhaging money. The scholarship program alone would cost millions. And this wellness initiative? It's pure fantasy." "It's investment in our people," Charlotte countered. "Happy workers are productive workers. My father understood." "Ah yes, your father." Marcus's lip curled. "The board has concerns about your emotional stability, Charlotte. First, you abruptly cancel a critical restructuring plan. Then you start spouting nonsense about your dead father and hanging around with janitors. Now you're trying to turn a profitable corporation into a charity?" Charlotte felt her cheeks burn. "How dare you? The stock is in free fall," the second board member cut in, waving his phone. "Down 15% now. Major investors are calling for answers." "Damage control isn't possible while you're at the helm," Marcus added. "The board is calling for a vote of no confidence. You have 1 week to either resign gracefully or be removed." Charlotte's vision blurred at the edges. "You can't do this. The Legacy Initiative is sound. If you just look at the projections—" "The projections?" Marcus laughed harshly. Written by that same janitor who's been filling your head with stories? Wake up, Charlotte. This isn't some fairy tale about your father's ghost. This is business. The third board member, an elderly woman who'd always supported Charlotte, stepped forward. Perhaps if you agreed to scale back some of the more ambitious aspects of the initiative. No, Charlotte's voice was firm despite her racing heart. These changes are right for the company and right for our workers. Then you leave us no choice. Marcus straightened his tie. 1 week, Charlotte. Use it wisely. He turned and walked out, the others following in his wake. Charlotte stood alone in her office, the morning sun now feeling more like a spotlight. Her phone kept buzzing, more messages, more bad news. The stock was down 18%. Major news networks were picking up the story. Investors were demanding statements. Janet appeared in the doorway. Miss Whitmore? Legal is on line 1, and PR needs to know how to respond to— Cancel my meetings, Charlotte interrupted, gathering her things. I'm going home, but the press is waiting in the lobby, and use the private elevator. Have my car brought around back. The drive home was a blur. Charlotte sat in the back of her town car, watching the city stream past her window while the driver navigated through traffic. Everything she'd built, everything she'd worked for, it was crumbling around her. Not because she'd made the wrong choice, but because she'd finally made the right one. The elevator ride to her penthouse felt longer than usual. Inside, she dropped her designer bag on the marble counter and kicked off her shoes. The space that had always felt like a symbol of her success now felt empty, cold. Charlotte walked to the window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. 50 stories below, the city continued its busy Monday morning, unaware that her world was falling apart. She pulled her father's journal from her bag, running her fingers over the worn leather cover. "What would you do, Dad?" she whispered to the empty room. "How do you fight for what's right when everything you've built is at stake?" Only silence answered her question. Charlotte sank onto her white leather couch, the weight of the morning's events finally crushing down on her. For the first time in decades, she allowed herself to cry. The city lights twinkled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Charlotte's penthouse, but she barely noticed their beauty tonight. She sat in darkness, still wearing her work clothes, her blazer wrinkled from the longest board meeting of her career. An untouched glass of wine sat on the coffee table beside her father's worn journal. "You have 1 week," Board Chairman Stevens had declared, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "1 week before we vote on your removal." The words echoed in her mind like a cruel taunt. Charlotte pressed her fingers against her temples, trying to push away the memory of their faces. Smug, victorious, finally having the excuse they needed to get rid of her and her dangerous idealism, as they'd called it. Her phone buzzed again, the 20th call from reporters she'd ignored today. The stock had plummeted 15% by closing bell. Shareholders were panicking, and her inbox overflowed with angry emails demanding explanations. "What would you do, Dad?" she whispered to the darkness, picking up his journal. The leather felt soft, worn from years of use. She opened to a random page, his familiar handwriting swimming before her tired eyes. "True wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the lives we touch." Charlotte laughed bitterly. "Easy for you to say. You didn't have to answer to shareholders." She tossed the journal aside and stood up, pacing the polished hardwood floors of her immaculate penthouse. Everything here screamed success. The modern art on the walls, the designer furniture, the view that half of Manhattan would kill for. And now, it all felt hollow. The faces of the workers flashed through her mind. The single mother who'd thanked her with tears in her eyes, the elderly maintenance man who'd shared stories about working with her father, young Mia's innocent smile when she'd called Charlotte Auntie. She'd promised them all a better future, and now, I've failed them, she whispered, her voice breaking. "I failed you, Dad. I thought I could change things, but I was naive." Her eyes burned with unshed tears as she walked to the window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. 20 stories below, the city continued its nighttime bustle, unaware of her private crisis. The scholarship program would never launch now. The wage increases would be reversed. And Daniel would probably lose his job, along with hundreds of others. The thought of his gentle encouragement, his quiet faith in her, made her chest ache. A knock at her door startled her. Charlotte quickly wiped her eyes, though she had no intention of answering. The knock came again, more insistent. "Charlotte?" Daniel's voice came through the door. "I know you're in there. Please open up." She stood frozen, torn between wanting to hide and desperately needing a friendly face. After a long moment, she moved to the door, but didn't open it. "Go home, Daniel," she called out, hating how weak her voice sounded. "It's late, and Mia needs you." "Mia's with my sister," he replied. "I saw the news. We need to talk." Charlotte leaned against the door, closing her eyes. "There's nothing to talk about. It's over. I tried to honor my father's legacy, and I failed. The board wins." "That's not the Charlotte Whitmore I know talking," Daniel said firmly. "The woman I know doesn't give up when things get hard." "The woman you know is about to lose everything," Charlotte snapped, anger finally breaking through her despair. She yanked the door open to face him. "My career, my reputation, everything I've worked for, gone. And for what? Because I was foolish enough to think I could run a corporation with heart?" Daniel stood there in his janitor's uniform, probably having come straight from his evening shift. His kind eyes held no judgment, only concern, which somehow made it worse. "Your father lost everything once, too," he said quietly. "Did you read about that in his journals? The factory fire in '82? He rebuilt from nothing, Charlotte. And he did it without losing his soul." "This is different," Charlotte said bitterly. "The board has made up their minds. The press has already convicted me of being unstable. By this time next week, I'll be lucky if I can get a job managing a corner store." "So, you're just going to give up? Let them win?" Daniel's voice carried a hint of disappointment that cut deeper than any angry accusation could have. Charlotte stepped back from the door, suddenly exhausted. "Please, Daniel. Just go. I can't do this right now. I can't be the person you and my father wanted me to be. I tried, and I failed. Just leave me alone." "Charlotte, go!" Her voice cracked. Without waiting for his response, she closed the door, sliding the deadbolt into place with trembling fingers. Through the door, she heard Daniel sigh. "Your father never gave up on you, Charlotte. Don't give up on yourself." His footsteps retreated down the hallway, leaving Charlotte alone in her darkened penthouse. She sank to the floor, back against the door, and finally let the tears fall. Outside her window, the city lights continued to twinkle, indifferent to her despair. The morning sun cast long shadows across Charlotte's office, but she barely registered its warmth. Her usually pristine desk was scattered with newspapers, their bold headlines screaming about her supposed incompetence. She mechanically sorted through urgent messages and emails, each one a fresh reminder of the crisis she faced. A gentle knock at her door made her look up. Daniel stood there in his gray janitor's uniform, holding something in his hands. His face showed concern, but there was also determination in his eyes. "I know you asked to be left alone," he said softly, "but there's something you need to see." Charlotte's first instinct was to dismiss him, to retreat back into her shell of misery, but something in his steady gaze made her pause. "Come in," she said, her voice hoarse from lack of sleep. Daniel approached her desk carefully, like someone approaching a wounded animal. In his weathered hands was a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. "Your father gave this to me years ago, made me promise to keep it safe until the right moment." Charlotte stared at the envelope. Her father's familiar handwriting spelled out her name in faded blue ink. "Why didn't you give this to me before?" "He was specific about the timing," Daniel explained, placing the letter gently on her desk. "He said I'd know when you needed it most, when you might be tempted to give up on something important." Charlotte's hands trembled as she picked up the envelope. The paper felt fragile, like it might crumble under her touch. She glanced at Daniel, who nodded encouragingly. With careful fingers, she broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. The paper carried a faint scent of her father's old workshop, metal and motor oil, and something uniquely him. Her throat tightened as she began to read. "My dearest Charlotte, if you're reading this, I'm long gone, and you're facing a moment that's testing everything you believe in. I know something about those moments. They come to all of us who dare to stand for something bigger than ourselves. I remember when you were just a little girl, sitting on my workbench, watching me fix engines. You'd ask why I spent so many extra hours helping people who couldn't afford repairs. I told you it was the right thing to do, but I never fully explained why. You see, Charlotte, life isn't measured in dollars or titles. It's measured in the lives we touch, the hope we create, and the love we share. Every time I fixed a single mother's car for free, or helped a struggling family keep their vehicle running, I wasn't just fixing machines, I was fixing broken spirits, keeping dreams alive. I've watched you grow into a strong, capable woman, but somewhere along the way, I fear you started believing that strength means standing alone, that success means winning at all costs. That's not strength, sweetheart. Real strength is having the courage to stand for others when it would be easier to stand alone. I know the corporate world has taught you to be tough, to put profits first. But remember this: no balance sheet can measure the worth of a human soul. No quarterly report can capture the value of giving someone hope. There will be people who call you foolish for choosing compassion over convenience. They'll say you're naive, that business is business. But ask yourself this: at the end of your life, will you measure your success by the size of your bank account, or by the number of lives you've touched? I've always believed that true leadership isn't about making people follow you. It's about serving them, lifting them up, showing them their own worth. It's about having the courage to do what's right, even when it costs you something. Don't let fear of losing make you forget what's worth fighting for. Don't let the voices of doubt drown out the voice of your heart. You have more strength than you know, more courage than you believe. Remember the little girl who used to bring injured birds to me, begging me to help them? That compassionate heart is still inside you. Trust it. Follow it. Even when the path seems impossible, even when the whole world tells you you're wrong. I may not be there to hold your hand anymore, but I am with you in every act of kindness, every choice for love over fear. You are my greatest legacy, Charlotte, not because of your success, but because of your capacity to care. Whatever you're facing now, face it with love. Whatever battle you're fighting, fight it with compassion. Whatever you're building, build it with hope. I am so proud of you, my daughter. Not for what you've achieved, but for who you are and who you can become. With all my love, Dad. Charlotte's hands shook as she lowered the letter. Tears streamed down her face, dropping onto her father's words. She could hear his voice so clearly, as if he were standing right beside her desk, speaking these words directly to her heart. Daniel stood quietly by the window, giving her space to absorb the message. When she finally looked up at him, her eyes were red but clear, and something had shifted in her expression. "He knew," she whispered. "Somehow he knew I'd need these words exactly when." Her voice broke. Daniel nodded. "Your father was a wise man. He saw people's hearts, not just their surfaces. Like father, like daughter." Charlotte carefully folded the letter and pressed it to her chest, feeling her father's love wrap around her like a warm embrace. The morning sun suddenly seemed brighter, its warmth reaching into the corners of her office and her heart. Through her tears, she could finally see clearly what she needed to do. Her father's words echoed in her mind. "Don't let fear of losing make you forget what's worth fighting for." Charlotte's hands trembled as she read the last words of her father's letter. She carefully folded the paper and pressed it against her chest, feeling its weight like an anchor, grounding her to what mattered most. The morning light streaming through her office windows seemed brighter somehow, as if the fog of doubt had finally lifted. She reached for her phone, her movements decisive now. "Sarah, please call an emergency meeting with all department heads in the main conference room, and contact the worker representatives, all of them." Within an hour, the conference room was packed. Production supervisors sat shoulder to shoulder with maintenance staff. HR managers shared space with cafeteria workers. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Charlotte stood at the front, her father's letter in her hand. Gone was her usual polished corporate attire. She wore a simple blouse and slacks, looking more like the factory worker's daughter she truly was. "My father," she began, her voice clear and strong, "worked in factories like ours for 30 years. He never earned a fancy title or a corner office. But he understood something I forgot along the way, that a company isn't its stock price or its quarterly reports, it's its people." Murmurs rippled through the room. Charlotte continued, drawing strength from each face before her. The board thinks our new initiatives are reckless. They say we can't afford to treat workers with dignity. But I say we can't afford not to. She laid out her plan, not in corporate jargon, but in plain language her father would have used. Worker-owned shares, educational programs, health benefits that actually covered families, fair wages that meant no one needed a second job to make ends meet. Marcus, a veteran line supervisor, stood up. "Miss Whitmore, the board's going to fight this tooth and nail. How can we help?" Charlotte smiled, remembering her father's words about community. "We need to show them that these aren't just policies, they're people. Your stories, your families, your dreams. Will you share them?" The response was immediate. Workers began stepping forward, offering testimonials about how the new initiatives had already changed their lives. Sarah from accounting spoke about finally being able to afford her son's college tuition. James from maintenance described how the new health plan had covered his wife's cancer treatments. As the meeting progressed, phones came out. Social media posts began appearing. Local news reporters, tipped off by employees, gathered outside the building. By early afternoon, Charlotte was sitting with community leaders in the company cafeteria. Religious leaders, union representatives, and local business owners crowded around plastic tables, sharing coffee and ideas. The energy was electric. Reverend Johnson, his gray hair gleaming under the fluorescent lights, leaned forward. "This isn't just about one company anymore, Charlotte. You're showing that business can have a heart. We'll stand with you." Union leader Maria Rodriguez nodded firmly. "My people are ready to mobilize. Peaceful demonstrations, media outreach, whatever it takes. The board needs to see that the community won't accept going back to the old way." As the day wore on, Charlotte moved from meeting to meeting, but not in her usual executive style. She sat on desk corners in cramped offices, stood in factory break rooms, listened more than she spoke. Every conversation strengthened her resolve. By late afternoon, social media was buzzing. Local TV stations had picked up the story. "CEO fights for worker rights," read one headline. "Community rallies behind progressive business reform," declared another. Looking out her office window, Charlotte saw the first signs appearing in the plaza below. Workers on their breaks held handmade posters, "Fair wages, fair business, and people over profits." More people began gathering, not just employees, but their families too. Children sat on parents' shoulders, elderly couples held hands and signs. The crowd grew steadily. Food trucks appeared, donated by local businesses showing solidarity. Someone brought a guitar, and soon music filled the air. It wasn't a protest, it was a celebration of community. Charlotte made her way down to the plaza. As she stepped outside, the crowd parted. Faces turned toward her, not with the usual corporate deference, but with genuine warmth. These weren't just employees anymore, they were partners in something bigger than themselves. Daniel appeared at her side, Mia holding his hand. The little girl beamed up at Charlotte, waving a small sign she'd clearly made herself. "My Auntie Charlotte has a big heart." The plaza was now filled with hundreds of workers, their signs held high. "We stand with Charlotte." The afternoon sun caught the windows of the building behind them, creating a golden glow. In that moment, Charlotte felt something she hadn't experienced since she was a little girl, her father's presence, strong and sure, standing right beside her. She looked at the gathered crowd, at their hopeful faces and determined spirits. These were her father's people. No, they were her people now. And together, they would show the board what real leadership looked like. The mahogany-paneled boardroom felt different today. Charlotte stood at the head of the long table, her father's letter tucked safely in her blazer pocket. Around her, 12 stern faces stared back. The board members who had once praised her ruthless efficiency now viewed her as a threat to their profits. Miss Whitmore, Harrison Webb, the lead director, spoke first. His voice carried the practiced smoothness of someone used to getting his way. "The numbers speak for themselves. Share prices down 30%. Major investors threatening to pull out. Your recent, emotional decisions have put this company at risk." Charlotte remained standing, her spine straight. The morning sun streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows cast long shadows across the polished table. She could see her reflection in its surface, composed, determined, different from the woman who had stood in this same spot just weeks ago, ready to announce mass layoffs. "The board has reached a decision," Webb continued, sliding a document across the table. "We're requesting your immediate resignation. The severance package is more than generous." The other board members nodded in agreement. Most avoided her eyes, except for Margaret Chen, who had been her mentor when Charlotte first joined the company. There was something like regret in Margaret's expression. "Before I respond," Charlotte said, her voice clear and steady, "I'd like to share something with you." She pulled out her father's journal, its worn leather cover soft against her fingers. "This company was built on more than profit margins." "Miss Whitmore," Webb interrupted, "this is hardly the time for—" "It's exactly the time," Charlotte cut in, her tone firm but not harsh. "You see, my father worked in factories like ours for 30 years. He understood something we've forgotten, that a company's true worth isn't measured in quarterly reports." She opened the journal to a marked page. "He wrote this in 1985, during another economic downturn. Today I saw Tommy Miller crying in the break room. His daughter needs surgery, but he can't afford it. I went to management and offered to take unpaid leave so they could keep his health insurance going. They agreed. Some things matter more than money." Charlotte looked up, meeting each board member's eyes in turn. "That was my father, a man who understood that business without humanity is meaningless. And do you know what happened? The company didn't just survive that downturn, it thrived. Because when you treat workers with dignity, they give you their loyalty and their best effort in return." Webb's face had turned an interesting shade of red. This is precisely the kind of sentimental thinking that— A commotion from outside interrupted him. The sound of many voices grew louder, echoing up from the lobby 40 floors below. "What's going on?" Margaret Chen stood and walked to the window. Charlotte knew exactly what was happening. Daniel had promised to spread the word about the board meeting. She hadn't expected him to mobilize so quickly. "Your workers," she said quietly, "are showing you what real company loyalty looks like." The board members rushed to the windows. Below, hundreds of employees had gathered in the lobby and outside the building. Many held signs, "Stand with Charlotte," and "People over profits," and "Save our legacy." "This is outrageous," Webb spluttered. "Security will remove them." "Security won't do anything," Charlotte said. "Because they're down there too, along with their families. And the press." She pulled out her father's letter, the one Daniel had given her yesterday, and unfolded it carefully. "My father wrote this before he died. Charlotte," it says, "I've watched you climb so high, but remember, the view from the top means nothing if you've left your heart at the bottom. True leadership isn't about power over others, it's about power to help others. Stand firm in what you know is right." Charlotte squared her shoulders and faced the board directly. "I will not resign. This company doesn't belong just to shareholders. It belongs to every person who works here, who puts their trust in us, who believes in what we can be." Webb's face had gone from red to purple. "You can't." "I can and I will," Charlotte said. "And before you vote to remove me, you might want to look out those windows again." More people were arriving now. Local community leaders, families of workers, even customers who had heard about the situation and wanted to show support. News vans were pulling up, cameras rolling. "This isn't just about me anymore," Charlotte continued. "It's about choosing what kind of company we want to be. My father understood that profit without purpose is hollow. These people down there, they're not just workers, they're the heart and soul of everything we do." She took out her phone and held it up, showing them the trending social media posts. "The world is watching. They want to know if corporate America can still have a conscience. So yes, our stock price is down right now. But our worker productivity is up. Employee turnover is at an all-time low. And customer loyalty? It's soaring." Margaret Chen stepped away from the window, a thoughtful look on her face. "She's right, Harrison. The publicity from this, it could destroy us if we remove her. And maybe she's right about more than just that." Charlotte placed both palms on the table and leaned forward slightly. "I'm not asking you to be charity workers. I'm asking you to be smart business leaders who understand that long-term success comes from building something sustainable, something built on respect and dignity for all." The chants from below grew louder. Through the windows, they could see more news crews arriving. The crowd had swelled to fill the entire plaza. Webb looked from the windows to Charlotte, his face a mask of frustrated resignation. "You planned this?" "No," Charlotte said, touching her father's letter through her blazer pocket. "I just remembered who I was meant to be." She picked up the resignation letter from the table and tore it in half. "Now, shall we talk about the future? The real future, not just the next quarter's profits?" The board members exchanged glances. Even Webb seemed to deflate slightly, knowing he was beaten, at least for now. Outside, the crowd continued to grow, their voices rising in unified support of a leader who had finally found her true path. The tension in the boardroom crackled like electricity. Charlotte stood tall, her shoulders straight, as she faced the row of stern faces before her. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the growing crowd of supporters below looked like a sea of colorful dots, their chants muffled but unmistakable. "This is unprecedented," muttered Harold Barnes, the lead director, his face flushed with anger. He shuffled through papers, probably searching for some document that could save their position. "The disruption to our operations is minimal," Charlotte cut in, her voice steady. "Our productivity is up 15% since the Legacy Initiative began. Employee turnover has dropped to near zero." Sandra Chen, usually the most diplomatic board member, leaned forward. "The stock price, Charlotte. We can't ignore—" "Has already begun recovering," Charlotte said, sliding a tablet across the polished table. "Look at this morning's trading. The market is responding to our workers' solidarity. Customers are actively choosing our products because of our ethical stance." The board members huddled over the tablet, their whispers growing more urgent. Charlotte caught fragments of their heated discussion. "Par nightmare, can't remove her now, media circus." Through the windows, camera flashes sparkled like stars. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky. Charlotte allowed herself a small smile, remembering Daniel's words from earlier. "Your father always said the truth has a way of rising to the surface." Harold cleared his throat, his expression sour. "Miss Whitmore, while we still have serious concerns about your unconventional approach, it appears we must consider the current climate of public opinion." Charlotte's heart quickened, but she kept her face neutral. Years of corporate negotiations had taught her the importance of appearing unmoved, even in victory. "Perhaps," Sandra added carefully, "we could reach a compromise, continue the Legacy Initiative, but with certain fiscal controls in place." "The initiative stays as is," Charlotte said firmly. "My father taught me that half measures serve no one. We either stand for something or we fall for anything." A ripple of murmurs passed through the board. Through the glass walls of the boardroom, Charlotte could see office workers gathering, their faces expectant. Among them stood Daniel, his kind eyes meeting hers with quiet confidence. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Harold spoke again. "We'll need assurances about quarterly targets, of course, and regular reviews of the program's impact." "Naturally," Charlotte agreed. "I'll have comprehensive reports prepared. But the core principles remain non-negotiable." The board members exchanged glances. One by one, they nodded reluctantly. Harold's shoulders sagged in defeat. "Very well, Miss Whitmore. You may retain your position as CEO. But remember, we'll be watching closely." Charlotte allowed herself to breathe fully for the first time in what felt like days. "Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Now, if you'll excuse me, I believe there are some people waiting to hear the news." She gathered her papers with deliberate calm, though her hands wanted to tremble with relief. As she walked toward the boardroom door, she caught her reflection in the glass. For a moment, she saw her father's determined expression mirrored in her own face. The elevator ride to the ground floor seemed to take forever. Charlotte used the time to compose herself, smoothing her blazer and taking deep breaths. When the doors opened to the lobby, she was nearly knocked back by the wall of sound that greeted her. Hundreds of employees packed the space, their faces anxious and hopeful. Security guards had given up trying to maintain order and stood to the side, many of them smiling. As Charlotte emerged, a hush fell over the crowd. She walked through the parting sea of people toward the main entrance, where Daniel and Mia waited. The little girl was perched on her father's shoulders, holding a hand-drawn sign that read, "We love you, Charlotte," in wobbly rainbow letters. Charlotte reached the glass doors and turned to face the crowd. "The Legacy Initiative stands," she announced, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent lobby. "And I'm staying right here with all of you." The eruption of cheers was deafening. People hugged each other, some wiping tears from their eyes. Charlotte pushed through the doors to where Daniel and Mia waited on the steps. Mia scrambled down from her father's shoulders and launched herself at Charlotte, wrapping her small arms around her waist. Daniel stepped forward, his eyes shining with pride, and enveloped them both in a warm embrace. The noise of the celebration faded to a distant roar as Charlotte closed her eyes, feeling the strength of Daniel's arms and the pure joy of Mia's hug. Here, in this moment, she felt her father's presence more strongly than ever. "We did it, Dad," she whispered, her words carried away by the wind and the sounds of triumph around them. Mia squeezed her tighter. "Grandpa would be so proud," she said with the simple wisdom of children. Charlotte opened her eyes to find Daniel watching her, his expression soft with understanding. They didn't need words to share this moment of victory, of family found and purpose renewed. Around them, employees continued to pour out of the building, their voices raised in celebration. Camera crews pushed closer, their lenses focused on this tableau of triumph. But Charlotte remained wrapped in the embrace of her newfound family, knowing that sometimes the greatest victories come not from fighting harder, but from loving deeper. The morning sun caught the glass of the skyscraper, sending rainbow reflections dancing across the crowd. It was a new day for the company, for its people, and for Charlotte. Her father's legacy lived on, not in profit margins or stock prices, but in the hearts of those who understood that true leadership begins with compassion. The morning sun painted the headquarters' glass facade in warm golden light. A gentle breeze carried the sweet scent of spring through the air as Charlotte stood before a gathered crowd of employees. Her hands rested on a small shovel, its metal head gleaming in the sunlight. Beside her, Daniel held a similar tool, while Mia bounced excitedly on her toes, clutching a child-sized garden spade. In front of them, a young maple sapling waited in its temporary pot, its tender leaves dancing in the wind. A polished stone marker lay nearby, ready to be placed. Charlotte took a deep breath, taking in the scene before her. Employees from every department had gathered. Factory workers in their work clothes, office staff in business attire, maintenance crews in their uniforms. They formed a semicircle around the small plot of earth that had been prepared for the planting. "Thank you all for coming today," Charlotte began, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "This tree represents more than just beautification of our grounds. It stands for the legacy of a man who understood that true success grows from compassion, not competition." She glanced at Daniel, who gave her an encouraging nod. His eyes held the same warmth they had shown when he first told her about her father's journals. Mia leaned against her father's side, her small hand wrapped around his. "My father worked in factories like ours for 30 years, Charlotte continued. He believed in the dignity of hard work, but more importantly, he believed in the dignity of workers. Today, we plant this tree in his memory, and as a promise to nurture the values he lived by." Several workers nodded, some wiping tears from their eyes. In the front row, Mrs. Martinez from accounting clutched her handkerchief, remembering how the canceled layoffs had saved her family from losing their home. Charlotte stepped toward the prepared soil. "This maple will grow strong and tall, just as our company will continue to thrive. Not through cutting corners or sacrificing our people, but by growing together, supporting each other, and remembering that every person here matters." Daniel moved forward with Mia, positioning themselves on either side of Charlotte. The little girl's face shone with determination as she gripped her shovel, ready for her important role in the ceremony. "Would you like to dig the first scoop, Mia?" Charlotte asked softly. Mia nodded enthusiastically. "I'm gonna dig the best hole ever for Great Uncle's tree," she declared, causing gentle laughter to ripple through the crowd. Over the past weeks, She had taken to referring to Charlotte's father as her honorary great-uncle, and somehow it felt right. Together, they began to work. Mia's small shovel carved into the earth, followed by Daniel's steady strokes and Charlotte's careful digging. The morning sun warmed their backs as they prepared the ground, working in comfortable silence punctuated by Mia's occasional excited comments. When the hole was ready, Charlotte carefully lifted the sapling from its pot, cradling the root ball as tenderly as she might hold a child. Daniel helped her lower it into place, while Mia watched with wide-eyed wonder. "Now we give it new earth to grow in," Daniel explained to his daughter, showing her how to gently fill in around the roots with fresh soil. His hands, strong and calloused from years of honest work, moved with surprising gentleness. Charlotte watched them work together, feeling a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the spring sunshine. These two people, who had started as strangers, had somehow become essential to her life. Through them, she had rediscovered not just her father's legacy, but her own capacity for love and connection. As they patted the last of the soil into place, the gathered employees broke into spontaneous applause. Charlotte stepped back, brushing earth from her hands, and surveyed their work. The young maple stood straight and proud, its leaves catching the morning light. Daniel placed the memorial stone at the tree's base. The inscription read simply, "In memory of James Whitmore, father, worker, friend to all. His compassion lives on." Mia tugged at Charlotte's sleeve. "Can I water it now? Daddy says trees need lots of water to grow strong." Charlotte smiled, reaching for the waiting watering can. "Of course you can, sweetheart." Together, they tipped the can, watching the water seep into the freshly turned earth. The crowd began to disperse, heading back to their workday, but Charlotte remained with Daniel and Mia, watching the trees sway gently in the spring breeze. Mia slipped her small hand into Charlotte's, and Charlotte felt Daniel's steady presence beside her. The tree before them stood as a promise of growth, of change, of life renewed. But more than that, it represented the truth Charlotte had finally embraced, that real strength came not from power or position, but from the courage to open one's heart to others. The maple's leaves rustled softly, catching the morning light, as if offering its own quiet blessing to this new beginning. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below, and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you enjoyed the story of Charlotte Whitmore, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.